Welcome to Policy Exchange and this event on shaping the agenda. Slightly unusually, we're going to actually start today with a brief screening of a short film. You're going to see Policy Exchange, the movie. So here we go.
In 2001, two members of Parliament, Francis Maude and Archie Norman, decided to embark on a new project to transform Westminster. They wanted to create a different kind of organisation for the new millennium, one that approached public policy challenges from a social as well as fiscally responsible perspective.
Well, we set up two things. We set up Sea Change, which was a pressure group to encourage the Conservative Party to make itself again a contemporary force in touch with Britain as it was, not Britain as some Conservatives wanted it to be. And then Policy Exchange was very much about filling what felt like a bit of an intellectual vacuum. There were some think tanks on the centre-right, but they were kind of felt a bit burdened down with history, carrying quite a lot of baggage from the 1970s and 1980s. And we felt actually there's a shelf life for think tanks, and there was time for a new one, and a sort of greenfield operation built from new.
Policy Exchange was founded in the autumn of 2002. Its principal aim was to produce new, workable policy ideas that would not only shape political thinking, but were also attractive to the majority of people outside the Westminster village. Nick Boles was approached to become Policy Exchange's first director, and Michael Gove, a Times newspaper columnist at the time, became the organisation's first chairman. Located in a tiny office in Storysgate, Westminster, Policy Exchange offered a completely different kind of setting and approach to the other more established think tanks of the time. A band of young thinkers began to meet on a regular basis.
I can remember sitting on the floor in Policy Exchange's first rather grubby offices with Nick Boles and Danny Finkelstein, your chairman, and George Osborne and others, as we discussed after the aftermath of the 1997 defeat for the centre-right, should the centre-right modernise? That was the question. Danny provided the Diet Coke. I think Nicholas Boles provided the pizza. I wonder whether the idea would ever catch on, but I seem to have benefited from it in some way. But it has been hugely influential.
Politics can become quite stale, and they get stuck in a rut. And the civil service, and there are many fantastic people working in the civil service, but they're so caught up in the day-to-day, either the day-to-day political battle or the day-to-day administrative battle of actually, getting houses built, getting benefit payments paid to people, getting people to school on time, that it's much harder for them to stand back and actually think about how to do things differently. And I think in particular also this country has been quite bad at learning from what other countries do. And the truth is there are lots of other countries that face quite similar challenges, particularly countries of a similar stage of economic and democratic development. And one of the things that Policy Exchange has always said is, let's have a look, see what other people do, see if there's something we can learn from it. Not to say that we can import ideas completely unreformed, they have to relate to our circumstances. But learning from others, having an open mind, doing proper research, looking at the evidence, and then making some quite bold proposals, that's something that it's hard to get out of government, it's hard to get out of politicians. You need think tanks to do it.
The first piece of research called for localism in the police force. It suggested the creation of elected police commissioners, something shortly to be introduced by the current coalition. Over the following years, Policy Exchange grew, and Boles recruited a young public affairs consultant called James O'Shaughnessy to become the organisation's first ever director of research.
Yeah, so my background had been education policy and was able to continue that having joined Policy Exchange. And the other big issue, I remember when I was being interviewed by Nicholas Boles and Francis Maude for the job, we talked about school policy. They'd already done some work. It was seen as a kind of cutting edge issue for people on the right. But the other issue which I brought up, which I really thought would chime with the values of the organisation, was on housing. You know, up until that point, for the previous sort of 15, 20 years, there had been a growing housing crisis, housing becoming more and more expensive, unaffordable for ordinary families. And I thought, actually, if you look historically at the role that housing has played for governments as a progressive issue, building more houses, whether you're Harold Macmillan or Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, about spreading the property-owning democracy. This was a great opportunity in a policy area that leads to growth, but actually is around, you know, helping ordinary families get the kind of homes that they want. And this was a huge issue that no one had touched. The Conservatives were very NIMBYist, the left was very top-down, wasn't delivering any units, so there was an opportunity there for us.
Boles and O'Shaughnessy wanted to focus on areas of policy close to their hearts and found a television producer in light entertainment with a passion for education to lead their thinking. Charlotte Leslie is now an MP and sits on the Education Select Committee.
When I joined Policy Exchange, Nick Boles and James O'Shaughnessy had been sort of working on this idea that I came in on, which turned into the report that we wrote, More Good School Places, which was about the pupil premium. And the challenge I suppose we were facing was, how do you create a level playing field for children who haven't had the advantages of children who've been born into a better socioeconomic background? And that policy very much came out of that, and that was an area I was always very interested in. I suppose my political energy always came from a sense of very basic glowing injustice about your life, where you go in life is so much dictated about where you've come from and what kind of background you're born into. And so that policy for me was combining two things that matter hugely to me, which is social justice and social mobility within the education field.
That was a very, very important report. It's actually, you know, produced pretty much 2/3 at any rate of the policies that the government is now pursuing, particularly the supply side policies, the policies of extending academy freedoms to all schools that want them and encouraging free schools, and crucially the policy of pupil premium, which I always get rather cross because some other people claim authorship for this idea. And actually, to be fair, the first person I think to come up with the idea of a pupil premium, an extra payment for disadvantaged kids, was Julian Legrand at the LSE. But we were the first people to work it up into a policy proposal. So I'm very proud of that. And that, of course, is already government policy. I think it's this year for the first time that schools will be receiving a chunk of money specifically related to the number of children who are on free school meals.
Janan Ganesh, now political correspondent at The Economist, joined the growing band of men and women who were slowly starting to make a name for themselves in the think tank world.
Well, probably the thing I did at Policy Exchange which caused the biggest splash was a pamphlet called Compassionate Conservatism, which I co-wrote with Jessie Norman, who is now an MP. And what made it unusual at the time was that it was a work of theory and kind of political philosophy, rather than policy, which can be dry and technical and quite jarring for someone outside of Westminster to get to grips with. And what we did with the Compassionate Conservatism, which came out in 2006, was, you know, a brief pamphlet which argued that for decades everyone in politics, and especially I suppose on the right, had dwelt on these two things, the state and the market, and had neglected what lies in between, which is civil society and community. And the new battleground of politics and policy would take place on that turf. And so we cobbled that thing together in a few months. And I remember we were kind of dubious about whether Nick Boles, who was director at the time, would go for it, precisely because it was such a departure from what Policy Exchange did. But he was very enthusiastic about it. And I think what appealed to him was that it provided Policy Exchange with a kind of overarching narrative which connected all the individual policy pamphlets that we were coming out with. And so if the theme of Compassionate Conservatism was giving power away, empowering communities, that was a natural umbrella which covered the things that we were publishing on police reform, schools reform, health reform, housing, planning, etc. So it was a kind of shorthand guide to the overall worldview of the think tank.
The modern-day Policy Exchange is unrecognisable from 10 years ago. Under the stewardship of Anthony Brown and now Neil O'Brien, the organisation is the biggest think tank in the UK and covers a wide range of domestic policy areas.
In the world after the recession, there are a whole bunch of new challenges. Firstly, trying to control public spending and bring the huge deficit under control, trying to get better growth and more jobs, and at the same time deliver stronger public services when there's not that much money around, so we need to be more innovative. And I think Policy Exchange can help do that because our research is grounded in the real world, it's based on empirical evidence, it's not just some kind of airy-fairy blue sky thinking. This is stuff that politicians can pick up and they can implement tomorrow to improve people's lives.
I'm genuinely delighted to be here tonight because I think Policy Exchange has had a great influence on our national life, is having a great influence, and I believe will go on to do even greater things in the future.
Oh, well, Policy Exchange is everywhere. I mean, it is enormously influential and has done everything and much more than I think I could have hoped for when it was a twinkle in my eye.
Well, the first thing I should say, because it's true, is that I had vastly more influence when I was running Policy Exchange than I do now as a junior backbencher. I mean, there is no question that good think tanks with a proper reputation for sort of fearless independence command a level, at a time when politicians command ever less respect, they command ever more respect, and you'll find that the media are much more likely to go to a think tank to ask for a view on something than they are to a politician.
And the reason Policy Exchange is seen, at least on the centre-right, as the place to go is partly because the ideas themselves are presented in such a kind of immediately accessible way. You know, the heavy lifting is done, but it's then packaged into an off-the-shelf policy solution to the problems of the day. And so it's easy for journalists to get their head around them. And the other thing is that Policy Exchange is still seen as hugely influential with politicians and with government. And I think being confident that the thing you're reading has a good chance of eventually being translated into government policy, or at least starting a conversation when it comes to government policy, is the ultimate incentive to read that pamphlet in the first place. You know you're not wasting your time.
Well, for me, it's quite simple. At the end of the day, if you want a policy that is actually going to work or could work in government, there's one place that you go to, and that's Policy Exchange. I mean, there are lots of think tanks. Lots of them produce opinion pieces, rants, you know, great rhetoric. Others, highly theoretical stuff. But the question is, each of those, can you actually take them off the shelf almost and do something about them? And the truth is, with a lot of them, you can't. And I think what Policy Exchange has always prided itself on, and still does now, is that the work that it does, the ideas that it comes up with, are pretty much oven ready. You know, a minister who wants to run with them can go to take a Policy Exchange report, look at some recommendations in it, and within months, which is relatively quick for government, to have something that reflects that in some detail. So that, if you like, that for me is the big contribution that Policy Exchange makes.
When I was writing the report with James, I never dreamt for a minute that a few years down the line I would be a candidate for the Conservative Party fighting a marginal seat, and the pupil premium would have been picked up and was so much a part of political dialogue. And then, of course, I would never have dreamt that the pupil premium itself would have been one of the major planks of forming the coalition. And to have seen a project from its inception right through to its playing a role in a government of which I was an MP was something that was absolutely extraordinary. And I would, if you told me that when I was working back on that report in 2005, I wouldn't have believed it, but I'd have been very happy.
Policy Exchange has come a long way over the past 10 years. There's an almost constant round of events and publications designed to share our thoughts with policy formers and opinion leaders across the political spectrum. More and more of our ideas are shaping government thinking on an increasingly wide range of topics, from behavioural change to counter-terrorism, from planning to economic growth. But at its heart, it remains what it set out to be: a research-driven generator of policies designed to modernise both the country and the government of it.
I'm incredibly proud of it, actually. I think the people who took it forward from the time when we set it up, the 3 directors there have done a superb job, and the chairman who've had custody of its affairs, I think it's done brilliantly. So I'm very, very proud of it.
So So, ladies and gentlemen, you probably have detected that this is our 10th birthday. My original plan, of course, was to have Danny explode out some kind of cake or something like that, but going for a more low-key approach. I should start, in fact, by thanking Charles and Matt for creating that wonderful film. I was obviously looking for more car chases and explosions and so on, but you get the general sense of what we're about and where we have come from. This event is part of a series of things that we're going to be doing over the next couple of months to celebrate that 10-year mark, which are about also defining what we are doing today in the landscape of politics now. So today's event, we're going to start with Danny talking a bit about how he sees the political challenges, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing recently and where we're going next. So, thank you for the over to you, Danny.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I have genuinely been to a party where someone burst out of a birthday cake. But it was Denise Van Alpen rather than me. I think he would be more disappointed. What I want to do is to set a political context in which I think a policy exchange is going to work, and then to look at some of the big areas that it will face challenges in. I want to start by asking you to imagine putting a hand in a bucket of cold water and a hand in a bucket of hot water. And when you take the hands out and put them both in a bucket of lukewarm water, the hand that was in the cold water will feel hot, and the hand that was in the hot water will feel cold. This is called the contrast principle, and it's one of the basic rules of politics. My favourite example of this was given by Robert Cialdini in his book Influence, about a young woman who was at university and sends a letter to mum and dad and says, "Dear mum, I'm terribly sorry to tell you that I've had concussion and I've been taken to hospital because I had to jump out of the first floor window when a fire destroyed all of my belongings. I was taken to hospital by a man from the petrol station across the road, and when I arrived there we realised that we'd begun to fall in love, and despite the fact that he's been married 6 times already, we've decided to get married. We hope to be married before the pregnancy shows." And she said, "Actually, I'm not pregnant, we're not intending to get married, I haven't met a man from the petrol station, there was no fire, I haven't got concussion, but I did fail my first year exam." And I wanted you to get it into perspective. This is the contrast principle. At the moment, the Conservative Party is benefiting from the contrast principle. Whether right or wrong, the electorate doesn't yet see Ed Miliband as a future Prime Minister. It does see David Cameron as the current Prime Minister, and the Conservative Party gains hugely from it, which is what makes the opinion polls very striking. It makes it quite striking that at this stage in the opinion polls, despite everyone saying Labour should be further ahead, it actually is ahead, despite everything that's been said about its leader. And I think that points to a question that people on the centre-right have to ask and people on the centre-left have to observe. Has there been, as a result of the Liberal Democrats joining in to the coalition with the Conservatives, a long-standing realignment in British politics? Has one of the things that helped the centre-right to win elections, which was a split left, come to an end as a result of Nick Clegg's decision to take the Liberal Democrats, or a large part of them, out of the left? Does that yield Labour a permanent, long-standing advantage, which means that the Conservatives start on the back foot in fighting general elections, not just because of seat distribution, but also because of a long-standing change to political terms of trade? And I think that any consideration of how politics is going to develop over the next 10 to 15 years requires people to consider what's happening, to take a sensible view about whether or not you think that Labour's position is weaker than it should be because its leader hasn't yet projected himself as a credible Prime Minister, or stronger than it should be because it's doing quite well despite that. And obviously whether you think a fundamental change to what the parties are doing to win majorities will depend on the view that you take. I think the Conservatives would be incautious to take anything other than a fairly radical view about the difficulties they might face. The second thing that I want to put in front of you is a study done of university fraternity rituals. This suggests that the more humiliating of the university fraternity ritual, the more likely you are to value membership of the fraternity. This is an obvious effect. You don't want to be an idiot who's taken part in a humiliating university fraternity ritual only to discover that the membership wasn't worth it. So, as people do, you rationalise it in your mind until you get to the point where it was worth it in your head. in my view, the Liberal Democrats, in order to join with the Conservatives, have gone through the most humiliating of divisions. Although I saw James Forsyth's speech this morning in The Spectator and his suggestion that the coalition will not last, I think a bit of basic psychology suggests that it's more likely than he thinks that it will. Not only because it's put in place certain things like the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, but because the Liberal Democrats have a tremendous need to demonstrate that they are capable of producing a coalition government that lasts and that coalition government can work, and most important of all, in order to prove to themselves that the decision that they took at the beginning of this Parliament was the right one and that they don't have to retreat from it in failure, as they don't have a tremendous amount of explanation for that if they do it. So I think the political environment is one in which there has been possibly a fundamental change in the terms of trade between parties, but secondly, it's one in which this Parliament is likely, very likely to last to the end, and I think the coalition will probably last with it, and parties will be making their policies in that environment. The third piece of politics environment, which is extremely important to understand, is that no one is following anything. The most important thing to understand about politics is that you're watching it and other people are not. The other day I did a news night in which David Laws was on talking about tax allowances. I was asked whether he was right in thinking that if he went out and campaigned for these increased tax allowances for low-paid workers, the Liberal Democrats would genuinely get the credit. And I had to explain that them getting the credit depended on a number of things. First of all, they had to know who David Laws was. This most people do not. Very few people don't. In fact, 50% of people couldn't recognise a picture of George Osborne and didn't know that he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Anybody who saw that, rather unfair, because they used to do it to the Conservatives as well, when William Hague was in office and make a big fuss about it. They did a thing, do you recognise Ed Miliband? And they went out and this woman said, I thought Tony Blair was leader of the Labour Party, and they seem to have moved from one to the other. You can't tell anything, is what she said. The electorate is not following these details in politics. It would also involve them having to know what a tax allowance was. This I don't believe they do. When the Liberal Democrats originally proposed their 1p extra on tax, and the policy became popular, when I was working for the Conservative Party, we tried to find out why that was. We discovered that people thought it meant literally putting 1p on their tax, which they were in favour of. When we actually asked them how much the tax they were prepared to pay, it didn't come even close to 1p in the pound, not remotely close to it. But they thought it went 1p because they didn't understand how the tax system works. So the idea that people will understand the concept of a tax allowance and removing people from it simply to overestimate how much people are following or they understand. And thirdly, not knowing who David Laws is and not understanding what a tax allowance is, they'll have to be following the fact that David Laws said something about the tax allowance, which they don't follow either. Just to give an idea of the focus groups that we used to do, asking people, do you know any Conservative apart from David Cameron was something the Conservatives did, and there was sort of long pause, and someone said Ed Balls, and someone said, oh yes, and his brother Ed Miliband. Although actually, this is not my favourite. My favourite was, do you know any Jews prominent in public life? When Michael Howard was leader of the Conservative Party, and there was a long pause in Nottingham, somebody said, oh yes, Whoopi Goldberg. So, anybody who, I get people protest a lot when I say this, because they think I'm patronising people, but actually, that's not what they do. An awful lot of the information about the Liberal Democrats' position on tax allowances is not of much interest to most people and doesn't make much difference to their life. They take a view, not actually that unreasonable, that if the tax allowances went up, then money would come back in some other way, probably off them. But people don't understand quite the depths of this. So let me just give you an example which I think does illustrate this. Recent polling into the question of how cuts influence people revealed that people said, oh yes, the cuts influence my life. And then when you said, how do the cuts influence your life? They'll say, my wife can't get so many shifts at Tesco. They don't actually realise that the word cuts is used in politics to refer to cuts in public spending. They think of cuts as cuts in their living standards. Words that we routinely use, backbencher, legislation, the legislature, the executive, those are more complicated words, but even quite simple words, things like cuts are not understood by voters, they're not followed by voters. So what do they follow? They follow what happens to them in their real life. In other words, actually quite cleverly, they concentrate on signal rather than noise. And a huge amount of what people do in politics concentrates on noise rather than signal. I remember following a political betting site, you've probably, several people in this room probably read it, a political betting site that Mike Smithson runs. It's a really great site. But then he once posited the fluctuation in the Liberal Democrats' vote was to do with Min Campbell's performance of Prime Minister's questions. When I asked my brother-in-law, who's absolutely passionate about politics, what did he think of last week's Prime Minister's questions, he replied, I don't know, I was working, which is what most people are doing when Prime Minister's questions are on, rather than watching it. So everyone in politics is very concerned about the last thing, but actually people have missed even who the people are, let alone what they've said. And we can concentrate a lot on the noise rather than the signal. What Policy Exchange obviously is trying to do is to concentrate on the things that produce signal rather than the things that produce noise. It is a criticism we happily take on board, that our work sometimes concentrates on actually the detail of what should happen on things that are not splashy but might make a difference if they were instituted, because we think that is really what moves politics. Because the more splashy things are only paid attention to by people in Westminster, the details might actually impact on people's lives. So that's the political context in which we operate. But of course there is one, I think, more significant economic factor really, which is there's no money and there's no growth. The letter that Liam Byrne left in the desk drawer, I felt sorry for him because I like Liam Byrne, but it is destined to be one of the great political documents. I'm sorry there's no money. This will set the task, that sets the task of the government, it sets the context in which things are done, and it sets Policy Exchange its job as well. Not having any growth, I think, provides three big challenges to any organisation working in policy and in politics. The first is this. This is more a problem, I think, for people on the centre-right. People are more willing to take risks when they face a loss. If what happens going to the next general election is that they are presented with the idea of continuing losses, they're more likely to vote for change against that background. The idea of being able to project to people that there is going to be future gain is critical to any engagement with the electorate, and certainly any attempt to get them to stick with the status quo. This means that any incumbent party who wants to get re-elected has got to deal with the growth issue. It can't deal with the public spending issue, because the public spending is now going to go into the next parliament. I think inevitably that provides the Labour Party with a problem, because they are going to have to try to show how they're going to deal with the reductions in public spending. That's a difficult issue for them to deal with. It means that the debt and deficit issue on which the Conservatives are doing well will stretch into the next parliament. But it will provide the incumbent party with this very great difficulty, which is that it will be trying to get people to vote against change when promising them a loss. It has to be able to demonstrate that it can provide people with growth. And yet, Conservatives have struggled for a growth policy. The Thatcher government did have an industrial policy, and that was to help the financial services sector. That is no longer a sufficient industrial policy. It wasn't a stupid policy, incidentally. That was a sensible thing to do, because that was a very important driver of the economy. But a tremendous intellectual challenge for the centre right now is to try to develop a serious industrial policy, to develop growth that goes with the grain of the free market thinking of Conservatives. That is a challenge for the centre-right, whereas the centre-left has obviously got a problem of trying to address its fairness agenda while being credible on the issue of getting business to grow. The the development of ideas that produce stronger cities, that try to identify sectors in which British science policy can concentrate, that even accepts the idea that we have, and David Willett's addressed this, didn't he, in a talk to Policy Exchange, accepts the idea that there is, on industrial policy, what I think he called vertical as well as horizontal policies. In other words, that we do take a view on what sort of sectors might drive the British economy in future. Even that is an ideological and intellectual problem for a lot of free market thinkers. And there will be no other free market think tank who is going to be able to look at that problem seriously, because all of them regard that as a problem that doesn't need solving, or whose solution is obvious starting from a theoretical base. It's a very big challenge to try to solve that problem without immediately getting into trying to create organisations like NEDO and ending up in summit conferences with trade union leaders, which won't work to produce any sort of growth. So is there a strategy for infrastructure, for the identification of future sectors of the British economy that will thrive, for training and skills that try to help in that sectoral approach that doesn't collapse into a beer and sandwiches approach with the unions, and doesn't collapse into picking losers. There's a lot of work to be done because so little successfully has been done, but there are serious reports like the McKinsey report, which concentrates on issues like planning, like issues of devolving government and devolving economy away from London, and looked at issues like infrastructure and the quality of the service sector and the quality of education and training in the service sector, that suggest that there are real technical solutions. I was very interested in Nick Boles' lecture on this subject. Very jealous that he gave it as a Macmillan lecture to the TRG rather than here, as Neil knows. But I think it's one of the things that we can't, I suppose, hold you always to giving everything here. And nevertheless, that is an area we are going to have to develop. Alongside this, in a period of no growth, the issue of fairness will rise. The left has always had a problem on the issue of fairness because they've misunderstood it, because they've equated fairness with equality, when fairness is really about getting out something in proportion to what you put in. And I think that Ed Miliband's conference speech, which made some big, politically difficult mistakes, nevertheless had in it a core that was very important intellectually, and was also reflected in David Cameron's speech, which was the idea that you must get something for something, rather than something for nothing. And the big, intelligent, political, strategic speeches, Bill Clinton was on this theme as well, of the last 15 and 20 years, have understood that this is what the electorate mean by fairness. It's the idea of reciprocation, the idea that I put in and I get out. Reciprocation issues are always the hottest topics in politics. Welfare fraud, immigration, crime, bankers' bonuses, they're all the same sort of putting in and getting out issues. And it's kind of, it's almost disappointingly cliche to say that the left does particularly well dealing with issues of rich people's bonuses, and the right does particularly well dealing with welfare fraud. But that is nevertheless the issue. Trying to, clearly producing growth that produces the fairness issue is the best solution for both. Tony Crosland in his book on the future of socialism understood that the left needed growth because it couldn't tackle the fairness issue without it, and the right needs to understand that too. And I think that doing anything that impedes growth, that reduces growth, is probably not a very sensible idea strategically. Nevertheless, finding ways that deal with the issue of how you ensure that what people put in is what they get out is, I think, going to be a very big idea, a big area of work for policy exchange. Conditionality and welfare benefits has been a big area, but obviously trying to deal with some of these issues at the top end of the scale will be very important. And this other really difficult issue, which Bill Clinton deals with in his otherwise not great book about the economy, which is how do you produce what he called American dream growth. And we've had growth that can help people at the top and the bottom, but how do you help these vast group of people? And in Britain, actually, incidentally, the term middle doesn't work quite the same way as it works in America. Fewer people call themselves middle in this country than do in America, where almost everyone thinks they're in the middle. Nevertheless, this American dream growth that lifts all the boats, that is obviously going to be the best way of dealing with fairness. But how do we deal with this issue of reciprocation will also be important. So these two things, I think, will be the big immediate agenda. And then will come a final thing, which is that when we reach the end of the process of trying to get the finances back in shape, when we reach the end of the austerity program, how do we produce a strong, robust society that that can exist without producing the same problem again of incredibly high rates of public spending that get out of control? What sort of institutions are there that are self-sustaining? How do we introduce into government mechanisms that prevent government from overspending just because they've got a boom that they don't recognise exists? What do we do for the long terms? Those, I think, are policy exchanges' big challenges. And the way of judging whether or not they're successful is exactly the way that film judged, which is, do they impact upon people's real lives? Because it's only if they do that they'll make a political impact. Thank you.
So, I thought I would talk a little bit about what we've been doing, what we're going to be doing next, because I'm conscious that even though we have lots of friends and collaborators and people we work with in the room, it can be quite difficult amid the thousands of things that we do to detect what the overall themes are in our work. In terms of stats behind us about the blizzard of news coverage and egg sarnies which we produce. And amongst all that, what does it all add up to? Whoop. We have technology, and that's one there. Here we go. So 3 big themes in what we're doing really at the moment. As Danny said, growth and jobs, number one thing, public service reform behind that, and then a third thing behind that, which is partly about fairness. It's about tackling the root causes of poverty rather than trying to paper over the cracks with more income transfers. And I thought at the end, if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about some very interesting work we're doing on changes in the electorate and trying to answer the question, what do voters want now? So, growth and jobs. Lots of different ways we can think about this. One of the first big things you would want to do is try and reform the welfare system. So I was on Sabre the other day and I said that in the most recent statistics, we had the same number of people on out-of-work benefits as we had in 2004. Actually, someone from the organisation Fact Check rang me up because they couldn't believe this. But it is true. All the way through the years of the debt fuel boom, we had between 4, 5, 6 million people on out-of-work benefits. And I think the reason why this wasn't as big an issue at the time when we felt like we had full unemployment is partly that we were looking at too narrow a measure, and it's also partly because of where it is. So in the places where the political class live and work, in London, in Oxford, Cambridge, these kind of places, the nice bits of Britain, you've got incredibly low unemployment, nearly 0% in some of these places. In other parts of the country, in Rochdale, where Mrs. Gillian Duffy confronted Gordon Brown during the last election, 75% of adults there are on out-of-work benefits. So, a huge problem. What can we do about it? So part of this is about the welfare system. Now, Ian Duncan-Smith at DWP, just down the road, is working away on trying to improve people's financial incentives to work and to try and simplify the benefit system, the so-called universal credit. That program is an important one and it's in train. And he's aiming to try and get the first people moving on to that new system in 2014. But there is a whole other half of the welfare reform agenda which is much less well developed than that, and that is, roughly speaking, the conditionality agenda. How do job centres work? So we've already been doing some work on this. We started actually by talking about the issue of fairness, what people thought was fair and not fair. We found, as Danny said, that people's idea of fairness is much more about something for something than it is about equality. And we also found that there was very, very strong support for the idea that if you've been on out-of-work benefits for a reasonably long period, you should be asked to be doing something in return for those benefits, perhaps work there. About 80% of people supported the idea that if you've been out of work for more than a year, you should actually do community work in return for your benefits. So there's very strong support for this conditional welfare agenda, potentially. How do you actually make it work? A big part of this, of course, is about being clever with data. So it's a terrible piece of jargon, but trying to have better segmentation or tailoring in the benefit system. At the moment, We ask people very few questions in job centres. We don't find out that much about them. We don't do anything clever with that data. We don't buy in data from the private sector. We don't even use administrative data that the government already has. And if we bring all of those things together, then we can start to be clever and predict those who are going to struggle to find work on their very first day of trying to claim job seekers allowance, rather than doing as we do at present, waiting for a year to see who struggles, by which time those who do struggle, and perhaps we could have predicted that at the start, will have rusted, they'll have become demoralised, they'll have a big hole in their CV and they'll be hard to employ. So that's one of the things we've talked about. We've talked about reforming job centres, perhaps doing something a little bit like we do in Australia, where really the only role of government is to do that first assessment of people and then hand them over to specialist providers at a much earlier stage. We've talked a bit about conditionality, trying to get people doing more to get back into work. Some people on job seekers allowance are spending very little time every day searching for work, as little as 8 minutes every day. How can we activate them more in the jargon? When job seekers allowance came in 1996 and people for the first time were required to go and sign on every 2 weeks, that was very, very controversial at the time. Now, of course, nobody would question that. It's done all over the world. It's incredibly effective. Just giving people a prod all the time to check they're still looking for work. But we can, of course, do much more. We can be cleverer about what we ask people to do at the moment. When you go and sign on, you could say, you know, I've looked for work because I have read the paper or I've gone online. And that's enough. We need to be more activating and get people searching harder. We are also about to publish some work on the CSA and what to do about absent fathers on benefits. So what next? One of the things we'll be looking at is reforming the work programme, obviously very controversial and in the papers this week for the wrong reasons. But while the model is broadly right, we think that we can improve on the way the work programme works. At the moment, quite crude categories of people lumping together, for example, the street homeless with people who've been on benefits for a reasonably long time, will probably lead to creaming and parking of people unless we reform it. We're thinking about workless communities, thinking about places like Rochdale, in fact, where unemployment is very high. We know from the social research that the stigma around unemployment goes down. Unemployment becomes normalised. People believe that they can't find a job. People increasingly believe that work doesn't pay. What could we do to use some of those behaviour change techniques, to use some of that social psychology that Danny talked about, to try and help those communities? We're going to be thinking about how to reform the sanction system. At the moment, advisors are loath to, of course, sanction people for not complying with the rules, for not going to job interviews, for not trying hard enough, because they don't want to impoverish people. Could we do something smart like they do in Australia, where perhaps the sanction isn't a financial one, but that if you, don't play by the rules, you get given a card to have your benefits on that prevents you from spending on gambling or drink or tobacco, different kind of sanctions that might actually be used by advisors. And contributory welfare. So politicians have honed in on this something for something idea of welfare very strongly. But how do you make it happen? When our welfare system was set up by Lloyd George and then by Beveridge, they were determined that it would be a very contributory system, that it would reflect what you paid in. But as time has gone on, every time there's a fiscal crisis, government always takes money away from those who have contributed because they need it less than the people who are on needs-based welfare. And we've ended up, in a bit of absence of mind, with a very uncontributory system. In fact, in the UK, we are a real outlier. Most other countries have some kind of unemployment insurance which relates what you get much more strongly to what you put in. Can we get back in that direction? So, we could think about the welfare system when we're thinking about growth and jobs. We could think also, I think a lot of the frontier of economics at the moment are about economic geography. So we've already been thinking about housing and planning, 2 brilliant reports by my colleague Alex Morton on this. Firstly, thinking about how we can do a better planning reform. So the government have got beaten up over their really quite limited reform of the planning system. Can we come up with a planning system that try and breaks us out of this framework where you're either an NIMBY or you want to concrete over the countryside and force houses down people's throats? Can we get a planning system that mediates all those externalities between people better? Perhaps, for example, by giving actual cash to people who are most affected by developments near them, rather than some kind of incentive for their local council. Because, of course, it's not much consolation to you if you've had a housing estate built right next to you to know that your council now has the money to build a mini roundabout on the other edge of town. It doesn't really make things up to you. How can we also boost the growth of our cities? So economic geographers like Ed Glaser, who was here lecturing a while back, have shown us that cities are absolutely crucial to productivity growth. The same person living in a bigger city like London will be more productive and earn a lot more than if they were living in a small town. So how can we make our cities bigger and livable? One idea we've been talking about is new garden cities, something that George Osborne picked up on in his autumn statement last year, and we've been talking to the cities team who are thinking about that. Other ways of doing it, of course, are about making our cities more livable by using the buildings that we've already got. So our big issue, particularly in a lot of northern towns, is dead town centres. Lots of shuttered shops. When I was back in Huddersfield, there were 17 charity shops. The town centre looks a mess. And so we're going to end up in a crazy situation at the moment where we might have a housing crisis for expensive housing, particularly for young people, not being able to get the housing ladder with house prices too high for people to be able to buy, but at the same time loads of empty shops. And how are we able to achieve this weird and terrible paradoxical result? And in essence, that of course is state planning by local governments. Local governments still have the power to stop you changing dead office space and dead shops into useful housing. The government are thinking about changing that, and George Osborne's promised to do something about it, but we will be watching with interest to see what happens. Our next big project in that will be looking at social housing. So social housing in this country is worth £400 billion. Despite what people think, actually we still have one of the biggest social housing sectors in Europe. Even though we've sold a lot off, we had such a large amount to start off with, we have a lot of social housing in Britain. We've talked a lot about the perverse incentives in the cash benefit system, but people haven't really thought very much about the perverse incentives in social housing. We have, since the 1977 Housing Act, basically said the way to get social housing, which is worth a lot more often than cash benefits, particularly if you live in inner London, the way to get a social house is to be very dependent. You have to be on an out-of-work benefit or to be otherwise needy. How can we start to change those incentives? Should we, for example, be selling off some of the most expensive stock of social housing? Could be worth a lot of money. We could use that money to build more social housing elsewhere, perhaps in cheaper areas. So we've got a strong growth policy there that would see a lot more new housing built. Finance, of course, is another part of the growth story. We've been looking at the Bank of England and the attempt to bring in the new macroprudential regulation there. Our slight worry about that is that the Bank of England still isn't bringing enough people in from the markets to be their eyes and ears in the city. It's still too academic an institution. Next couple of things we're going to be touching on are things like remuneration. Obviously, a hugely hot potato, and Danny talked about fairness. We need to be a bit clear about what we're trying to solve. What is the problem here? Is it that we're worried about rewards for failure, because that suggests one set of solutions? Or is it that we are worried about perverse incentives to do risky things, because that's a different question again? Or is it just that we are worried about the overall level of remuneration, because that's a different sort of problem again? So we're going to be thinking about that. We've got some good ideas on that. Thinking also about capital requirements. So, of course, the effect of trying to raise capital requirements, as we're doing at the moment, radically, at this point in the cycle, is going to be to constrict lending. That is going to slow growth. Is it the right time to be doing this? Is it a sensible idea? And we'll obviously be thinking a lot about European legislation, because there are about 50 pieces of European financial legislation currently in the pipeline. So, something we'll be getting our arms around. People often talk, when they talk about getting growth of jobs, they say, let's cut tax and regulation, and it doesn't get any further than that. So let's think more specifically about regulation. We've been doing some work here in a series called Greener, Cheaper, which takes as its guiding thought the idea that we are now going to spend hundreds of billions of pounds on decarbonising our economy. Very, very expensive. We could do that, we could hit our green targets a lot more cheaply if we were prepared to adopt a more market-driven approach, not to try and specify particular expensive technologies. So there's a particular opportunity there. We've been thinking about electricity markets, which were a good example of a utility we formed in the Thatcher years, which had become very effective, which the government is now dismantling and taking us back in a kind of dirigiste direction. We're thinking about water as well as an example of a network industry worth a lot of money, which at the moment is effectively a series of stodgy regional monopolies. Could we introduce market forces there as well? So you can detect that we're kind of revisiting some of those privatisations of the big utilities in the past, and in the near future we're going to also be thinking about trains and airports in London. Trains obviously dear to the hearts of everyone like me who stands there every morning with someone's armpit in their face, sweating on Southwest trains. We've got to think obviously about the public sector, a large part of the UK economy. We've done lots of work on the public sector pay premium. Even when you don't look at the difference between pensions between the state and the private sector, there is a substantial public sector pay premium now, but it varies hugely around the country. There is not really a pay premium for public sector workers in London. There is a huge pay premium for public sector workers in the less prosperous parts of the country, northeast, northwest, Northern Ireland, Yorkshire, that kind of thing. And that's a major problem. People can see, I think, now, in the debate, that that's unfair, because, of course, you're effectively overpaying people in some areas more than they need because the cost of living there is low, and you're underpaying people in expensive areas, so you get shortages, and you can see from academic research, in fact, that leads to, for example, increased death rates in NHS hospitals in London, poorer quality of teaching in some parts of the country. So it's clearly unfair and inefficient, but actually there's a second round question here, which is to do with what it does to the private sector. If you have a very large public sector and you pay over the odds, one of the things is you do, and you bid up wages in the private sector too, and that's one of the things that we think is holding back growth in the less prosperous parts of the UK. So George Osborne has promised that he will think about whether we can move to more local pay bargaining. The people who are going to be doing that work, of course, are the people who currently set national pay, so they may not have an incentive to dismantle the system that they currently operate, so we need to think about that. But we will be doing some independent thinking about that. Can we move not just to some kind of regional pay system in the public sector, but better still to what they do in Sweden, which is to have truly individual paying in the public sector, as we do in the private, on the basis of individuals' performance. So those are a bunch of different ideas about growth and jobs. Let's talk about public service reform. And of course these two things are linked, because of course if we have a more productive public sector, they'll have to pay less in tax, we'll have better economic growth overall. Policing and criminal justice. Doing a lot of work here. We're doing things on police efficiency. There are a lot of forces where you have a third of officers not making a single arrest in a year, using very expensive police officers in completely the wrong way, and the incentives at the moment set up in such a way that, in fact, some of these processes of reform, where the police have done more outsourcing, for example, are actually going into reverse as the cuts start to bite. Difficult landscape in criminal justice, of course, because the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice are facing both 25% real terms reductions in their budgets, one of the areas most squeezed in the public spending squeeze. So we need to be very smart, and we need to, again, break out of the paradigm that says it's all about spending more, having more people. As people have argued in events like our recent thing on predictive policing in America, and Bill Bratton's lecture here, deployment trumps employment. It's not about how many police officers you have, it's about how you use them and how efficient the force is. So we've been doing a lot of work on that. We've been thinking about how to get people in prison working and being productive. We've been looking at the ground-up innovations that are happening in criminal justice. We looked, for example, at the amazing HOPE project in Hawaii, where people with drug problems are monitored every single day, and if they don't comply with their drug orders for a single day, they're immediately given a very short prison sentence, not long one. But the point is the instant enforcement and the complete consistency, not big penalties. Very interesting innovations going on all over the world. We thought about how you replace community sentences, which are of course a joke, where 50% of them are not completed, with work orders which are more demanding and completed, and actually reform people so we don't then end up having to put them in prison at great expense. And we're currently thinking about policing in 2020 and some of the innovations and the new technologies that we could use. We're going to be thinking about pricing prison. You know, for a certain number of prison places, how do we use that estate effectively? The government are currently doing a huge number of prison privatizations, which is a kind of big reform that's happening without a lot of public attention. We're going to be thinking about alternatives to prison. How do you stop spending so much money sending people there? Thinking about police commissioners and their future powers. We talked about how the Policy Exchange had been behind that idea originally. Can we expand out from the idea of someone elected to help run the police to the idea of somebody who might be responsible for the whole criminal justice system, so they could, for example, move money away from, let's say, prison and spend it on prevention, have a little bit more flexibility to innovate. And we'll be thinking about the courts. Courts are very expensive, slow-moving, but there are innovations. There are things like virtual courts. The whole thing could go quicker, or we could do things like they do in the US and have proper community courts where the sentences are actually tailored to the problem-solving justice. You know, if you've got a drug problem, if that's why you're stealing, we deal with that rather than just send you to jail. In education, we just published even this week a big report on social enterprise schools, bringing profit into the sector so we can have much faster transformation of the sector and much faster taking out of the underperforming schools. We're going to be looking at school federations. James O'Shaughnessy, who you saw in the videos, come back to do a quick project for us on school federations. We've got very interested in childcare, which we're going to be publishing on. It's a big, hot political potato at the moment. And we're also going to be thinking a bit about the early years. So I find reading the evidence on the Sure Start programme incredibly depressing, because the evidence insofar as there is a proper evaluation is that it's not doing much to raise children's cognitive abilities at age 5. So if we want to ever close the education gap, ever have real equality of opportunity in Britain, we need to do something that's more effective. What is it? In health, we've talked about GP commissioning, obviously again quite a controversial area at the moment, and we're about to be publishing some stuff on integrated care, joining up GPs and hospitals so we can get people out of expensive hospital beds quicker and into the community. And we're thinking a lot about digital public services too. We've got our new units under Chris Yu doing very exciting things. He's thinking about the right to data. Can we use all that great data that the public sector has collected at great expense? Can we give that out and create new industries and new value? And thinking about digital public services too. So to take an example, the DWP spends £6 billion a year administration alone. And we know that the cost of doing a benefits claim online is 1/100th of the cost of doing it the traditional way. And yet only about 2, 3, 4% of all claims are done online at the moment. Can we be more ambitious? Can we have 21st century public services? Can we use the data that government generates in a cleverer way? At the moment, government is a great producer of data, but it doesn't really produce analysis. We don't use that information to do clever things. And in the future, we should. And even though jobs and growth are the top political priority at the moment, and we've got masses to do on public service reform, all of those issues about fairness and poverty are not going away. And I suppose our big fault in this area is to do with moving from an agenda, the Gordon Brown agenda of ever greater tax credits, giving people money, poverty is a financial issue, you just give people a check and it's solved, to thinking about the root causes. Why do people end up poor in the first place? So we've talked about reforming the child poverty target, which is a disaster area. Current child poverty target, for example, shows you that poverty appears to be declining because of the recession, and that tells you that something is wrong with the measure. So creating a causes of poverty target. Let's track instead the indicators that lead to future poverty. Let's look at teenage pregnancy, let's look at dropping out of school, let's look at kids who get into trouble with the criminal justice system at an early stage. And then within each of those things, how do we then solve those individual problems? So we've done quite a bit of work already on adoption and fostering. 60,000 children in the care system, tiny, tiny percentage, 0.01% of all children. Yet those children go on to comprise a quarter of all the people in jail, a third of all the London street mummers, and about half of all prostitutes. So they're tiny, but it's got incredibly concentrated impact on future poverty. How can we deal with those causes of future poverty, like the failure of the care system? And all the other things too. So we're going to be looking at children's homes and social work. We're keen to look at some of these things like truancy too. So we're very interested in tackling the underlying causes of poverty. And lastly, but not least, we're doing this huge project on the modern electorate. And this is, I'm afraid, just a bit of a teaser because we're still doing the work. If you think about New Labour, one of the things that it was a response to was huge changes in the electorate. So the classic base of the Labour Party, people in council housing, people in trade unions, people in the manual working class, all those things were declining. And people like Tony Blair and Philip Gould realised that they had to change their party to respond to those changes. And of course the electorate hasn't stopped changing, it's changing in myriad ways. And so we are doing a huge polling and qualitative research exercise at the moment with a particular focus on the North and the Midlands, and particularly the urban and rural divide, to try and understand what's going on in today's electorate and what they actually want. And the differences around the country are enormous. So for example, the Tory lead among people in the rural south is 42 points. The Tory lead among people in urban areas in the north is minus 43 points. So you have these absolutely vast differences around the country. And we have all these terms in political debate like aspirational voters, strivers, the squeeze middle. What are these? What do they mean? Do people actually identify them? And what do people actually want? So if you do a classic opinion poll, people say, what are the top issues facing the country? And they say, it's unemployment, the NHS, and immigration. Those are always the top three. But let's think a little bit more about people's everyday lives. What will people notice? What have politicians done for you lately? Have they got your bin emptied on time? Is it about fuel prices? Is it about making your area look pretty? What does actually affect people's everyday lives? And what do people ultimately want from our political parties? And of course, the interesting thing about doing this work is we find all these different things that people want. And as you probably sense from the presentation, we have lots of solutions and we are now going in the business of identifying the problems to which we have the solutions already. We're well under development, so it's all under control. And I think we now have some time for questions and answers. We'll get Danny back as well. And so if you want to ask us anything, really, just put up your hand and say who you are and where you're from. Weighed in with criticisms, personal attacks, anything you'd like. Let's start here.
I'm Simon Miller from Facebook. I noticed you mentioned Scotland at all, which was rather surprising given it's been a kind of hot political topic. Is that if you don't think it's going to play out in this Parliament as a key issue?
Well, it might. There are lots of things I didn't mention. Is the answer to that, the real answer. It might, and there's certainly some, I think the most interesting question in British politics over Scotland will turn out to be the English question, not the Scottish one. I think Scotland almost, that's probably too strong, most probably, and that with a strong likelihood will reject the idea of independence. But in the process of the debate, actually, I think English political leaders will have most difficulty trying to stick to the strategy that Tony Blair outlined for solving the West Lothian question, which was don't ask it. And if you ask the West Lothian question, it becomes increasingly difficult to give any sort of reasonable answer. There are a lot of constitutional questions that can, of course, be wrapped in. If we are going to we're going to change the second chamber, we're going to move to a situation where we've got a Prime Minister who has a strong executive based in Downing Street and wants to bring in people from outside who are not elected in Parliament, and we have potentially a federal situation with Scottish and Welsh running a lot of issues which the English can't affect, and it not being really right for the Scottish to be able to run those themselves and also to be casting votes in England as well. Should you move towards some sort of separation of powers? I suppose the reason why I didn't really mention it is that no one cares about those issues. I mean, the Scottish people do to some extent. One of the reasons why Tony Blair's strategy has worked out so far is that people are just not aware of it, not interested in it. These constitutional issues just don't generate interest, as AV demonstrates. The big problem with the House of Lords reform that Nick Clegg is proposing is not that people disapprove of it, but that it might be a long-standing political row that takes all the attention of the government and essentially the opposition on an issue that no one's interested in.
Sorry, Danny, a quick anecdote. I was a chemist in the Midlands about a week ago, and a chap in front of me was asked, did he pay for his prescription? He said no. And unusually, the chemist said, do you mind me asking you why you look fit and healthy? He said, because I'm Scottish. And he genuinely believed because he was Scots, he didn't have to pay his prescription in England.
David Ardley, oil and gas. Okay. This question of getting the economy going, competitiveness, and so on and so forth. I mean, the thing that cries out more than anything in my mind, or I think to a considerable degree in our minds, is the nation's infrastructure. I mean, by most standards, it is pretty creaky. And to give you a very simple example, during some of the extreme weather the last 2 winters, Scotland, of course, suffered far more than England in many respects. And you get more than 5 miles from Aberdeen, and broadband almost doesn't exist. So you can imagine people trapped at home, they can't work in the way that we expect to work down here. It's just appalling. Never mind transport, chaotic in places. So investment in infrastructure seems to be one area where the government really could make a difference. And if you're going to stimulate it, it's one thing to cut corporation tax, but that is a long, slow burning fuse of doubtful sort of incentive. But if you put in capital allowances for certain types of investment, whether it's infrastructure or capital plant in manufacturing, or that kind of thing, surely that's one way where the government could have a much more immediate effect and stimulate investment which this country desperately needs.
No. So two good questions there. One, we are doing something about the transport thing. So I think there are two separate questions. One's about using what we've got in a much smarter way. So Eddington did his report a few years ago about using prices and using behaviour change things to reduce peak demand, which is a smart thing to do, which we haven't yet done. So for example, in London, thinking about peak fares, how do you get people to move off of that peak, which gives you all the cost of running the railways. We also need to think about building some more of it as well, so we will look at things like whether we should be building, for example, the Crossrail 2 and things like that to add infrastructure. On broadband, we are going to look at this. I'm slightly sceptical about what the government is doing in terms of trying to roll out very expensive, very fast broadband to every single part of the country, no matter how remote, because most of the cost is in that last 10%. Shouldn't we do something smarter for the last little bit of it? And on capital allowances and like, we did write a bit about this before, with suggesting that the government should have a target of trying to, over time, equivalize the taxation of labour and capital. Debt and equity taxation. So we have written a bit about that, and I think it's just an interesting point.
Hi, just two things that spring to mind. I'd be interested to hear your views. Particularly around public service reform, what would be your approach to pin by results in relation to that area? And the other thing that springs to mind around poverty is the localisation of a lot of politics. And again, I think over the coming years that a lot of your talk, especially around Westminster, they're going to be local authorities, job centres will be active all powers, etc. So it's an interesting shift both in terms of the political side of things, but also in terms of voters and their relation to these issues. And then the final little bit is about the role of the media within the electorate. I think that's a fundamental aspect of how people form their opinions. Are you doing anything around that?
Can we split this in two along those lines? So, payment by results, payment by outcomes, we think is very interesting. We, in fact, will shortly be doing a big seminar on this, because I think it is important, and there are similar principles at work in terms of trying to pay for outcomes in welfare, in rehabilitation after prison, in all the other areas where the government are keen to introduce it. And there's a tension between what you were saying about trying to have more localism and trying to have centralised payment by results systems, and of course that stops that from happening. I think there's another sort of question which is related to that, which we'll try and do some work on, which is about the capacity and the role of the civil service and other policymakers, because going from being someone running a command and control service to someone who is kind of a market regulator, let's say for the welfare to work industry, it's a very different kind of role, different set of skills that you need. So we're very interested in it. We'll do some work on it soon. I think it's an important question, and it's not obvious that it's just a sort of panacea to everything. But I do think it's important. On the media.
A few months ago, I was writing an article about top people's pay, and I used Frank Lampard, the Chelsea football player, as an example of, for one reason or another, in this piece. And one of my colleagues said to me, "I don't know who Frank Lampard is." And I said, "That's extraordinary, you read the Times every day and he's all through it." And she said, "Well, I just don't read that part." One thing that's worth remembering about media power is that even people who read the newspapers don't read an awful lot of it, and it doesn't interest them. They tend to read human interest stories, and that does influence them to a certain extent. But because they don't read the whole paper, I think that's one reason why media power is often overestimated. Another reason is that I think the media follows what people think much more than the people think follows the media. During the whole row that surrounded my own company and its conduct, there seemed to be a sort of feeling, particularly on the left, that if Rupert Murdoch didn't exist, people would be in favour of crime and immigration. and this is just an illusion. These papers, and basically the Daily Mail, which has an angry attitude towards everything, is read by people who have an angry attitude towards everything, and that's who reads that paper. Not everyone does. So I would say that I think people can overestimate the power that the media has to influence people, and underestimate the power that people have to influence the media. I also think it's the case that we're seeing a fundamental change in the media, and there's going to be much more diversity, and it'll be much less obvious what, in quotes, the media think. And although it's the case that at the moment, because the Times is selling itself online, as some people may know, the digital subscriptions are going brilliantly well, but the paper sales are going extremely badly. And that's what's happening to media watching. So I think you can overestimate it. I don't, however, I'm not a purist. I do think, obviously, that what people are able to see on media influences them to some extent, and obviously it's an area of interest. But whether it would really be a sensible area for policy exchange, because obviously everything's of interest and we could concentrate on everything, I'm not sure. It's more Neil's decision than mine, but I think with policy exchange, our big challenge is always to try to focus so that we're not doing so many things that no one can follow the strands of work that we're doing. I'm not sure that trying to see how the media-shaped opinion would really fall into our remit, but I think we disagree.
Stuart, there's a light just come.
Stuart Wheeler, Treasurer of UK. The government is plainly retreating on climate change. It doesn't admit it, but it's reducing the subsidies and all that kind of thing. But policy exchange does a lot of work on how to deal with climate change problems, but apparently is quite unwilling to do any work on whether climate change is a problem at all. And the fact is now that it's not settled, science is not settled. What is settled is that it's costing an enormous amount of money in electricity bills to take the measures that are being taken and so forth. And should not policy exchange examine the question whether it's a problem?
Well, I suppose the answer to that is partly what Danny just said, which is that we can't do everything. I mean, we take as our starting point that it is a problem, because from a policy point of view, we talked in the video about how what we're doing is pragmatic, and that is what is happening now. Policymakers have decided that it is a problem. I suspect it probably is a problem as well, though we can argue about how big it is or what the uncertainties are. So within that framework that we have, how do you make it cost effective? How do you make it useful and in fact meaningful? Because what strikes me about what the government's doing at the moment, if you look at our paper on carbon emissions, is that we haven't actually managed to reduce our emissions at all. We've sort of patted ourselves on the back in Europe for about a decade and a half, saying, we've done we're brilliantly at reducing our emissions, and in fact, if you look at the consumption and the carbon content of our imports, actually our emissions have gone through the roof. So we haven't actually done anything really to decarbonise over the last couple of decades. So we've been coming up with an approach which is less damaging to the economy and it actually does more to try and solve the problem by not wasting resources, and also by focusing on changing technology. Because my own attitude is, unless you do something about Chinese coal burn and things like that, then you're not really moving the economy. There's a piece on shale gas which we have out probably in the next couple of days. Even just moving all of China's coal burning to gas burning would reduce emissions by more than 5 times, shutting down the entire UK. So we're not, I think, thinking about this as a very global problem. I mean, you're right, we do not do stuff on whether climate change is real or not, because the balance of people of opinion is it definitely is real. And so
but just a very small balance.
Well, let me just, I'm genuinely impressed when people say the science is uncertain, unless they're a climate scientist. Because when when you read even one book on the subject, Bjorn Lomborg's book on the economics, it was this thick. Who has time to do that? I concluded that I found out that it's no longer possible to be an expert on the Kennedy assassination. You have to specialise. Because there's so much information now that it's impossible to be an expert on everything. And I realised I'm never going to be an expert on climate change. And it is possible, you're quite right, that the very large consensus of scientists is not. It is a large consensus of scientists that there is such a thing as man-made global warming. Does begin to break down when you try to ask people to what extent does it cost, and what are the ways of dealing with it? Should you do? Is it? What is the curve like? Should you expect a catastrophic effect, or can you mitigate it? Which is a lot of the arguments with which Nigel Lawson obviously engages. There's even a dispute about whether or not there's a consensus. So before you can even there's every sort of dispute. It just seems to me that for not one institution that believes in free markets and low costs public spending to deal with the central hypothesis that climate change exists would be foolish. So the position that policy exchange takes, which is to be an organisation that is sceptical about spending the public money, against too much intervention into industry, always looking how you can do things, working with the grain of markets, looking what alternatives are. For that organisation to engage with the very large chance, but no stronger than that, that climate change is a real man-made phenomenon that is very serious, does seem to be quite a good exchange of effort. Because if we don't do that from our perspective, is there any other organisation that's going to do that? Not from that, it'll only be done then on the left by people who don't believe in free markets. So it seems to be quite a good use of our time because we're the only organisation that's working in that area. That would be my answer.
So anything else? I think we are back to our time. There are two last questions if we can take them together. You know, our former colleagues and from the Telegraph at the back.
Hi, Gabriel Doctor, formerly of policy. I was just curious about when you were talking about the growth as an electoral strategy, and to kind of summarise, you said many of us don't believe it's possible to have a government-led growth policy, but we need one if the right is to sort of win the next election. So, as you said, that leaves you with a very small window of possible options. Can I just ask what sort of areas of policy you think might be effective?
Clearly what's being done in the area of education and skills is important. Planning, deregulation is important. We'll have a lot of things to add. Planning, deregulation is a really important issue. The infrastructure policy is a very important issue. Trying to determine where you put your money into scientific research is an important issue. Creating strong cities, because they do seem to drive growth. Trying to decentralise economic and political power out of London and creating centres of political management outside and political classes that exist outside London. All of those can form part of the strategy, but there may be other things.
I mean, I mean, politicians are obsessed with the idea of clusters and creating clusters and the like. But of course, sort of legislation stops the development of our best performing clusters. You know, very hard for you to build anywhere in that space between Oxford, Cambridge, and London, exactly where we need industry to grow. And I think there is a genuine question. Though we did work before on industrial policy and why it's generally been a failure in the past. And everyone mentioned Nido, and I had a former older colleague who worked there, you know, producing Labour's national plan for Britain, which projected tractor production 10 years ahead. And of course, on the first day of the publication of the national plan, they ran out of copies because they hadn't managed to anticipate the demand for shortly after that, you find yourself working by candlelight. So I'm a bit of an industrial policy skeptic, but there is a legitimate question about the boundary between science policy and industry. So we have generally encouraged academics to climb up and you must commercialise your research at an early stage. Don't talk to any companies in case they steal your secrets. We probably need to get them to relax a little bit about that and think more about those university clusters in particular that are so important for growth. And that, if that's what industrial policy is, then that's a good thing. But if it means trying to recreate British Labour, it's probably not such a hot idea. Very quickly,
Danny, you mentioned that Labour's sort of position is sort of more fundamentally stronger than many people would think, and you know there's a strong likelihood that they could form a government within that 10-year period that you're talking about. Yet there's also a sense that Labour and the left is always sort of closing itself off in order to arguments in a way that didn't happen under there when you had the sort of reasonable people you could engage with on sort of market-based reforms. Are there any particular sort of thinkers or ideas that are coming out of the left that you're particularly impressed by or think that someone like Policy Exchange could build on?
That's a very good question. Well, actually, okay, I strangely enough, I do think the engagement that Ed Miliband's had with the issue of something for nothing is, and actually also with the squeeze middle, which taken out of its American terminology, because the problem with the squeeze middle is that you then can't find who's not in it. Means the question of the question of the value of the labour of less skilled but still working people. Those do seem to me he does seem to me in those areas to have hit upon the questions that the left ought to answer. I'm not very impressed with how he then moves to answer any of those. And I mean, the difficulty of the political position the Conservative Party finds itself in is it's not impossible to imagine him winning an election despite that. I don't think it's been a very impressive performance intellectually or on television. And and I think the electorate will think that. And actually, you know, I have to say, I think that will be a very strong advantage for the Conservative Party in next election. That is the case. But nevertheless, you know, they have moved away from Blairism to a sort of centre, to a sort of more left-wing position without really understanding what populates that. And I actually think it's ended up being about more spending. But they have at least, but the only area where it's been more impressive is in terms of trying to define what the questions are. But then when you try to think how they're going to answer them, in particular the question of how you get low-wage people to earn higher wages, which is a lot of what actually, you know, what a lot of what Miliband's speeches actually mean is that we need to have those kind of, as it were, middle workers that are earning much better. It's not obvious what his answer is. If the only answer is to take the money from the better off people and give it to those people, that we think will not work.
If I could just have a last addition to that. I do think the sort of work that the Resolution Foundation are doing on the squeeze middle and that kind of thing is interesting. But I think there's a reasonable chance that it's kind of based on a wrong premise. So people have looked at how wages stagnated even before the recession for people on median incomes. And one reason that might have happened, of course, is the growth of tax credits since 2002. Because the tax credits are a good thing in lots of ways and encourage work. They also bid down wages, and that might be part of the explanation which they're not really thinking enough about. I also think that it's well worth us engaging, if we get a chance at some point, with the growth of inequality in all industrialised countries since the 1970s. Why has that happened? There are certain obvious answers which are to do with skill-biased technological change. You know, the computer increases the productivity of the highly skilled person and puts the less skilled person out of the job. But there are lots of other things going on in the labour market that are important too. The growth of workless households, the polarisation of work into double earner couples and zero earner couples with less people with one income. Some of those I think are very important. The fact just that the number of workless households is twice as high as it was in the 1970s. People think of unemployment as having gone up in the 80s and after a while come down, and went up in the early 90s and came down, and we had kind of full employment in the Blair years. We didn't. Actually, if you look at the total number of people on out-of-work benefits, we include those people on income support and IB, where they got parked on incapacity benefits until they were sick. Actually, what happened is that unemployment went up in the 80s, flatlined, went up again in the 90s, and it never really came down all the way through the years of the debt fuel boom. It started to go down a little bit, but not enough, and that's why we go into this recession with the number of workless households twice as high as it was in the 70s. So I think that's what's driven the increasing inequality over the last 30 years, and that's why we're so interested in the labour market and trying to change some of those things. So I think it's a big question, and you won't, you know, it can't go on forever having an ever increasing gap between the top and the bottom of society. That politically will not work, and I think the right need to have some answers to that. Otherwise, simplistic solutions will tend to dominate.
Neil, that's a very eloquent answer, and it's the first time I've heard that statistic. I don't know why I haven't heard it before, it's the first time. So why are you saying it and we're not hearing it from some of our politicians?
We haven't done the work yet. So somebody needs to give us a big check and we'll come up with all the answers.
But that is a phenomenally powerful statistic.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are now definitely out of time. Thank you all for coming. You are all our friends and colleagues, and you've all worked with us, and I'd like to thank you for that. And I'd also like to thank Danny for coming and giving his political take too. So thank you very much.